My beloved child, something shifted yesterday in a way none of them expected, and the strangest part is that it did not begin with an argument, a confession, or some dramatic confrontation. It began with silence. A silence so revealing that the third party finally noticed what she had been trying not to notice for far too long. She looked at him and realized that even while he was physically present, some part of him was somewhere else. His attention wandered whenever certain memories surfaced. His expression changed whenever something reminded him of the past. And slowly, painfully, one question began forming inside her mind: what if she had never truly been the person he was moving toward, but only the person he had been using to run away from what he still felt for you? Don't skip this moment, because the answer did not arrive all at once. It came through tiny details she had previously dismissed. A song he immediately changed. A place he avoided explaining. A conversation that became strangely quiet the moment your name was almost mentioned. None of these things seemed important alone, but yesterday they began connecting like pieces of a picture she could no longer pretend not to see. And when that picture finally became clear, something inside her collapsed, not because she suddenly hated you, and not because he had openly chosen anyone in front of her, but because she realized she had been competing with a memory that had never really left him. Here is where the story becomes more complicated. She had believed that time would eventually make him forget whatever existed between you. She believed enough new experiences could overwrite old emotions. She believed if she stayed close enough, cared enough, and made herself important enough, eventually the chapter involving you would feel distant. But there was something she misunderstood. Genuine attachment does not always disappear simply because someone refuses to speak about it. Sometimes silence does the opposite. Sometimes the things a person tries hardest not to mention become the very things quietly shaping every decision they make. Yesterday, she saw that possibility in his face. He was sitting beside her, yet when she asked one simple question, one question she had asked casually before, his answer came differently. There was hesitation. Not much. Just enough. And perhaps you know that kind of hesitation. The kind that lasts only a second but somehow says more than an entire conversation. She asked him whether he had finally moved on from everything that happened before their relationship began. He said yes. But his eyes told a more complicated story. That was the moment she stopped listening only to his words. She began remembering everything. Every time he compared a situation to something from his past. Every time his mood shifted without explanation. Every time she felt as though she had walked into a story that began long before her arrival. Suddenly she understood something she had resisted admitting: she had not been building on empty ground. There was already something there. Something unfinished. Something carrying your shadow even when nobody said your name. Stay till the end of this part, because what she did after realizing this is where the quiet heartbreak began turning into something neither of them expected. At first, she did not confront him. That is important. Instead, she watched. She wanted confirmation. Maybe she hoped she was imagining everything. Maybe she wanted him to prove her wrong without knowing he was being tested. So she brought up the future. Nothing dramatic, just ordinary plans. Places they might go. Things they might do months from now. And she noticed something unsettling. Whenever she spoke about the future, he responded politely. calmly, almost mechanically. But when the conversation accidentally touched the past, his entire energy changed. Suddenly he became more careful, more emotionally present, more guarded. Why would someone protect a chapter that supposedly meant nothing anymore? That question stayed with her. Then another memory returned. Weeks earlier, she had noticed him staring at his phone after receiving a notification. She never saw what it said. She never asked. At the time, she told herself it was irrelevant. Yesterday, however, that forgotten moment returned with new meaning. She remembered the way he had gone quiet afterward. She remembered how distant he seemed for the rest of that evening. And one possibility began bothering her more than anything else. Maybe he had not chosen her because his heart was completely available. Maybe he had chosen closeness because loneliness frightened him more than he admitted. Maybe being with someone new was easier than sitting alone with feelings connected to you. And suddenly her anger was not aimed in only one direction. Part of it turned toward him. Part of it turned toward herself. And yes, part of it began drifting toward you even though you had not done anything in that room. Something important is waiting for you here, because this is where the word revenge begins to mean something very different from what you might expect. She was not planning anything dangerous. She was not imagining destruction. What she wanted was emotional control. She wanted him to feel what she had just felt. She wanted the truth forced into the open. And more than anything, she wanted to stop being the person who discovered everything last. So yesterday evening, she finally asked the question directly. Was I ever really the person you wanted, or was I just the person who helped you stop thinking about someone else? He did not answer immediately. And that pause changed everything. Had he laughed and dismissed it, perhaps she would have let it go. Had he confidently reassured her, perhaps the story would have ended there. But he went silent. His expression softened, then tightened, as though he was choosing between honesty and comfort. She saw him struggling with something he had apparently been avoiding for a long time. Then he admitted a piece of the truth. Not everything. Just enough. He told her that when they first grew close, he had been trying to move forward from feelings he did not fully understand. He said he thought entering something new would help him stop looking backward. He insisted he had never intended to use anyone. But intention and impact are not always the same thing, are they? That distinction struck her immediately. Because whether he had planned it or not, she suddenly felt as though she had been standing inside someone else's unfinished goodbye. And then came the realization that truly broke her composure. She asked him whether the feelings connected to you were completely gone now. Another pause. Longer this time. And instead of saying yes, he whispered that he did not know. Imagine the weight of those 3 words. Not a declaration. Not a reunion. Not some dramatic promise. Just uncertainty. Yet sometimes uncertainty tells you exactly where a person's heart is still searching. She stepped away from the conversation because she needed distance. For the first time, she stopped trying to convince herself that everything between them had been stronger than whatever existed before. She began understanding that perhaps she had been measuring herself against something invisible all along. And that is where her sadness became determination. She wanted answers. She wanted to know what had really happened between you and him. She wanted to understand why he had never emotionally closed that door. But beneath those questions was another motive she had not yet admitted aloud. She wanted to prove that she could make him choose her completely. Her idea of revenge was beginning to form around one thought: if she could expose whatever feelings remained, force him to confront them, and then make him stay with her anyway, she could finally feel as though she had won. But something unexpected happened before she could act on that plan. Later that night, she overheard him speaking to someone he trusted. She was not searching for secrets. She simply walked near enough to hear one sentence. One sentence that changed the direction of everything. He said, quietly, "I thought being with someone else would make it disappear." It didn't. She froze. Because now there was no room left for interpretation. He had confirmed the very thing she feared. Whatever he had tried to bury had followed him forward. And although he still had not said exactly what he wanted to do about it, she finally understood why his presence with her sometimes felt incomplete. Something in him had remained emotionally connected to a chapter involving you. She walked away before hearing anything else, and for several minutes she simply sat alone trying to understand what this meant for her. Her first emotion was humiliation. Then sadness. Then anger. Then something quieter: clarity. She realized she could no longer continue pretending she had not seen what she had seen. But here is the twist she never anticipated: the clearer everything became, the less certain she felt about blaming you. Because another thought entered her mind. What if you did not even know any of this? What if you had been living your own life while he privately carried memories he never resolved? What if she had spent months treating you like competition when the real conflict had always existed inside him? That thought unsettled her even more than jealousy. Because if you were not responsible, then revenge against you would solve nothing. The person she needed answers from was standing much closer. She went back to him and said something he never expected. "I need you to stop protecting everyone from the truth." He looked confused. She continued, calmly this time. She told him she did not want another partial answer. She did not want reassurance designed to keep the peace. She wanted to know whether, if he had the chance to speak to you without pride, history, or anyone else's expectations interfering, there was something he would still want to say. His face changed again. And that was the moment she knew. Not because he confessed some perfect romantic sentence, but because emotion appeared before language did. He looked down. He breathed slowly. And finally he admitted that yes, there were things left unsaid. Things he had replayed privately. Things he had wondered whether you understood. She had expected that answer to make her furious. Instead, it made her strangely calm. Because uncertainty had been more exhausting than truth. Now she knew where she stood. Yet what happened next is the reason this story is only beginning. She told him that if something remained unfinished, she wanted him to confront it. He stared at her, stunned, because he expected anger, accusations, perhaps an ultimatum. But she gave him something more unsettling: permission to be honest. At least, that is what it looked like on the surface. Deep inside, however, another intention was forming. She wanted to see what would happen if he could no longer hide behind distance. Would he finally discover that whatever he felt for you belonged only to memory? Or would speaking to you awaken something he had been trying to suppress? She needed to know, even if the answer changed everything. And while she sat there believing she had taken control of the situation, she had no idea that he had already made one quiet decision before their conversation ended. He was going to reach toward the past. Not impulsively. Not dramatically. Carefully. Because there was one truth involving you that he had never told the third party, and once she discovers what that truth actually is, her idea of revenge is going to change in a way nobody in this story is prepared for. The strange thing is, he did not reach for his phone immediately. He sat there long after the conversation ended, staring at nothing in particular, because the decision he had just made felt heavier now that it was real. For months, he had imagined what he might say if he ever had the chance to speak honestly to you again, but imagination is safe. Imagination never has to face an answer. Imagination never has to discover whether the person on the other side has changed, healed, moved forward, or simply stopped waiting. And suddenly that became his greatest uncertainty. What if you were no longer standing emotionally where he had left you? What if all this time he had been trying to escape feelings that you had already learned to understand without him? He picked up the phone once, unlocked it, then placed it back down. A few minutes later, he did it again. Something about that small hesitation revealed more than any dramatic gesture could have. He was not afraid of sending words. He was afraid of what those words might reveal about himself. Don't skip this part, because while he was struggling with whether to contact you, the third party was beginning to experience a completely different realization. She had expected relief after finally hearing the truth. Instead, she felt strangely empty. The mystery was gone, but in its place stood a much harder question. If he had entered their connection partly because he was trying to forget you, then which parts of their relationship had been genuine, and which parts had been attempts to escape something unresolved? She began replaying moments she once considered proof that he had chosen her completely. The thoughtful conversations. The quiet evenings. The future plans. None of them suddenly became fake, because human emotions are rarely that simple. He could have cared for her while still carrying unfinished feelings for you. And perhaps that complexity was the most difficult thing for her to accept. She wanted the story to contain one clear winner and one clear loser. She wanted a simple explanation that would make everything easier to judge. But instead, she was discovering three people standing inside three different versions of the same unfinished story. You had your experience. He had his regrets. She had her disappointment. And none of them completely knew what the others had been carrying. Then something unexpected happened. She stopped asking herself, "How do I make him regret this?" and started asking, "What exactly does he still feel for you?" That question quietly changed the direction of her plan. She no longer wanted merely to provoke him. She wanted proof. She wanted something undeniable. She wanted to see whether his attachment to you survived contact with reality, because memories can become polished over time. Distance can make someone remember the warmth and forget the misunderstandings. Perhaps, she thought, one real conversation with you would finally close the door. Maybe then he would return emotionally clearer, finally certain that the past belonged in the past. That possibility gave her temporary confidence. But there was one detail she still did not know. The thing he had never told her about you was not simply that he missed you. It went deeper than missing. He had been carrying one specific regret, one moment he believed had changed everything between you. And whenever he tried to move forward, his mind returned to it. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was ordinary enough that he had not understood its importance until much later. Stay a little longer, because this is where that hidden moment finally begins to surface. There had been a day, long before the third party became part of the story, when you had tried to tell him something important. Not some giant declaration. Not an ultimatum. Something softer. You had tried to explain that you were beginning to feel unseen. You wanted clarity. You wanted to know whether the connection mattered to him in the same way it mattered to you. But at that time, he had been emotionally guarded. Instead of answering honestly, he became distant. He changed the subject. He convinced himself there would always be another conversation, another day, another opportunity to explain what he was feeling. Then circumstances shifted. Distance grew. Pride entered the space where honesty should have been. And that second conversation never happened. At the time, he told himself it was probably for the best. Months later, however, those unfinished words began haunting his memory, not in some frightening way, but in the quiet manner of a sentence you wish you could go back and finish. That was what the third party had never understood. He was not simply comparing her to you. He was comparing his present self to the person he had been when he lost the chance to speak honestly. And perhaps that is why nothing new had completely erased you. You were connected not only to affection, but to a version of himself he wished he had handled differently. When the third party finally asked him what exactly remained unresolved, he hesitated again. She noticed it immediately. "There's more," she said. He did not deny it. Instead, he admitted something she was not prepared to hear. He told her that the last real conversation between you and him had ended without him saying what he actually felt. He told her he had spent months imagining how different things might have been if he had answered you honestly that day. And then he said the sentence that completely changed her understanding of the situation: "I didn't leave because I felt nothing. I pulled away because I didn't know how to handle how much it mattered." She went silent. Suddenly the entire story looked different. She had assumed you were someone he had simply failed to forget. Now she realized you were someone he had never properly chosen or released. That distinction mattered. Because forgetting a person and resolving a connection are not the same thing. One can happen with time. The other often requires truth. Her first instinct was to feel threatened again, but another thought quickly followed. If he had never given you honesty, then maybe you had spent your own time believing the connection meant less to him than it actually did. Maybe you had interpreted his distance as indifference. Maybe while he was trying to bury his emotions, you were learning to live without answers. Something important is waiting for you in that realization, because for the first time, the third party began imagining the situation from your side. Not perfectly. Not generously all at once. But enough to soften something inside her. She pictured what it might feel like to care about someone who suddenly became difficult to read. She imagined receiving silence where clarity should have been. And then she understood why revenge aimed at you would never give her the satisfaction she originally wanted. You had not taken something from her. If anything, both of you had been affected by the same avoidance. That understanding should have calmed the entire situation. Instead, it created a new complication. Because now she wanted the truth exposed even more. She wanted him to speak to you, not simply to test his feelings, but to see whether he could finally become the honest person he had failed to be before. Yet underneath that seemingly mature decision, one fragile hope remained. Perhaps after he spoke to you, he would discover that the emotional connection belonged only to an unfinished memory. Perhaps closure would bring him completely back toward her. So she told him, "If there's something you should have said, say it." He looked at her for a long moment, almost as though he suspected there was another meaning behind those words. And there was. She was giving him freedom, but she was also watching what he did with it. He picked up his phone again. This time he did not put it down. He opened the place where your name still existed. For several seconds he simply looked at it. Then he began typing. He wrote 3 lines. Deleted them. Wrote another sentence. Deleted that too. The third party watched from across the room without saying anything. Every erased sentence seemed to confirm how much thought he had invested in this moment. Eventually he stopped trying to sound impressive. He stopped trying to explain everything. He wrote something simple: "There's something I should have told you a long time ago. I don't know whether you want to hear it now, but I finally understand why my silence hurt both of us." His thumb hovered above the screen. And then he stopped again. Not because he had changed his mind. Because another possibility had entered his thoughts. What if sending a message only served his need for relief? What if contacting you unexpectedly disturbed the peace you had built? That question mattered to him more than the third party expected. He turned toward her and said, "Maybe saying it now would be selfish." For the first time since everything began unraveling, she saw something in him she had not expected: responsibility. He was no longer thinking only about what he wanted. He was considering what contact might mean for you. And strangely, that made her more emotional than his earlier confession. Because it showed that whatever remained between you was not simply obsession with the past. He still cared about your emotional space. He still wondered whether his presence would help or complicate your life. And now she had to confront the very thing she had been avoiding. His feelings for you might contain more care than she wanted to admit. She stepped away and looked toward the window, trying to steady herself. Then came another shift. Instead of telling him not to send it, she said, "Then don't contact her just to make yourself feel better. Only do it if you're willing to accept whatever answer comes back." That sentence surprised even her. Somewhere between wanting revenge and wanting certainty, she had become unwilling to participate in another half-truth. He looked at the unfinished message again. Slowly, he edited it. Removed the explanations. Removed anything that sounded like pressure. Removed every sentence that asked something from you. What remained was simply an acknowledgement that he had understood something too late, that you had deserved clarity, and that he was sorry for leaving important things unsaid. No demand. No request to return. No expectation. And that changed the entire emotional weight of the message. Because sometimes the most meaningful thing someone can offer is not, "Come back," but, "I finally understand what I should have given you then." His finger moved toward send. But just before touching the screen, another notification appeared. Not from you. From someone connected to his past. A person who knew more about what had happened between you than the third party realized. The message contained only a few words: "If you're thinking of contacting her, you need to know what she said after you disappeared." His entire expression changed. The third party noticed immediately. "What is it?" she asked. He turned the phone slightly away, not because he wanted to hide it forever, but because he needed a second to understand what he was seeing. Something about those words had unsettled the story he had been telling himself for months. He had always assumed you eventually stopped caring. He had convinced himself that your silence afterward meant you were relieved to move forward. That belief had made his own distance easier to justify. But now someone was suggesting there had been another side he never heard. The third party walked closer. "Read it," she said quietly. He opened the message. What followed was not dramatic. It was worse in a much quieter way. The person explained that after the last meaningful conversation between you and him, you had said you were not angry. You were simply tired of guessing whether you mattered. You had apparently said something like, "If someone wants to be part of my life, I shouldn't have to decode silence to know it." He read those words twice. Then a third time. Suddenly the regret he had carried became more precise. You had not walked away because you stopped feeling. You had walked away because uncertainty had become too heavy. And the third party, standing beside him, understood the implication at the exact same moment. He had spent all this time believing circumstances separated you. But perhaps what truly separated you was one conversation he never had the courage to finish. His eyes lowered toward the message he had been preparing to send you. Now it felt different. More important. More delicate. Yet before he could decide what to do, the third party asked one final question, one she had been afraid to ask until now. If she had known the truth back then, would you have chosen her? He looked up slowly. No immediate answer came. But unlike before, his silence was not confusion. It was recognition. And what he finally said next would completely transform the third party's idea of revenge, because for the first time, she was about to learn that you were never the person standing between them. The real obstacle had been something much closer to him all along. The answer came so quietly that for a second she wondered whether she had heard him correctly. He did not say your name with drama. He did not make some sweeping declaration about destiny. He simply looked down at the message still glowing on his phone and admitted, "If I had understood myself then, I think I would have stayed and tried to make it right." The room changed after that sentence. Not visibly. Nothing moved. Nothing shattered. Yet the third party suddenly understood that the question she had been asking for months had finally been answered, and somehow the answer was more complicated than rejection. He had not chosen her over you in the clean, certain way she once imagined. He had moved toward her while still carrying a decision he had never finished making. And now, instead of feeling only anger, she felt something she had not expected at all, disappointment in the version of him who had allowed everyone else to live inside his confusion. Don't skip this moment, because this is where her idea of revenge finally stopped being about you. She turned toward him and said, "Then why did you let me believe I was competing with someone who wasn't even here?" He had no polished answer. Perhaps that was the first honest thing about the entire situation. He told her he had never consciously thought of it that way. He had believed that moving forward meant refusing to look backward. He thought if he filled his days with enough new conversations, new routines, new memories, the unresolved part of him would eventually become quiet. But every time something meaningful developed between them, it reminded him of how badly he had handled something meaningful before. The third party listened, and suddenly she realized something that changed her anger completely. She had not been losing to you. She had been living beside a man who had never forgiven himself. That was the real obstacle. Not your presence. Not some secret competition. Not some invisible battle between two people. His own regret had been standing between him and every honest decision he tried to make. And perhaps you understand something about that, beloved listener. Sometimes people do not return emotionally to the past because the past was perfect. Sometimes they return because there is a version of themselves trapped there, still wishing they had spoken differently, acted sooner, listened longer, or understood what mattered before distance made the lesson obvious. The third party saw that truth now, and it took the sharp edge off her resentment toward you. But it created a new determination. If there was going to be any kind of revenge, she decided, it would not be against another person. It would be against the silence that had controlled all of them. She wanted the half-truths ended. She wanted the guessing ended. She wanted him to stop using uncertainty as a place to hide. And she wanted something else too, something she was almost afraid to admit. She wanted to see what happened when he finally faced the truth without anyone protecting him from the consequences. "Send the message," she said. He looked at her. "Are you sure?" She gave a small, tired smile. "No. But I'm sure I don't want to keep living beside a question." That line stayed with him. He looked back at the screen. The message was simple now. No emotional pressure. No attempt to reopen your life by force. Just acknowledgement. He wrote that he had finally understood how unfair his silence had been. He said he had mistaken avoidance for moving on. He said you had deserved honesty earlier, and he was sorry it took distance for him to understand that. Then, after thinking carefully, he added one final line, "You don't owe me an answer. I just didn't want the last thing you understood from me to be something that wasn't true. Something important is waiting for you here," because that final sentence affected the third party more than anything else he had written. She realized he was not asking you to rescue him from regret. He was not placing responsibility for his feelings in your hands. He was finally taking responsibility for the part he had played. And strangely, that made the entire situation feel less like a competition and more like a reckoning with truth. He pressed send. There was no dramatic music. No instant response. No miraculous sign. Just one message leaving the screen and 3 lives suddenly becoming less protected by silence. He placed the phone face down. The third party sat across from him. For several minutes neither spoke. The waiting became its own kind of mirror. He had no control over what you would say. She had no control over whether you would say anything at all. And you, wherever you were in this story, had no obligation to reopen something merely because someone else had finally found words. That reality mattered. The third party began to understand that her original wish for revenge had partly come from wanting control over an outcome she never truly owned. She wanted to decide who mattered more. She wanted proof that she had not been second. She wanted some final verdict that would restore her confidence. But emotions do not always arrive with rankings. Sometimes one connection can be real and still be built at the wrong time. Sometimes another can remain meaningful and still not guarantee a future. And sometimes the most honest outcome is not victory, but clarity. Hours passed without a response. At first, he checked the phone every few minutes. Then less often. Eventually he forced himself to stop. The third party noticed. "You expected her to answer," she said. "I hoped she might," he admitted. "That's different." She nodded slowly. There was growth inside that distinction. Hope without demand. Care without ownership. Regret without pretending it gave him a right to your attention. The night became quieter, and for the first time they talked about their relationship without treating you like a forbidden subject. She asked him when he first realized something inside him had not fully moved on. He told her there had been no single moment. It happened in pieces. The first time she showed him kindness after a difficult day, he remembered how you used to notice when he was pretending to be fine. The first time they disagreed, he remembered how often he had avoided difficult conversations with you instead of working through them. The first time she talked seriously about the future, he felt panic not because he disliked the future she described, but because he suddenly wondered whether he was entering it honestly. Hearing this was not easy for her, but it gave her something she had been missing: context. She could finally see that his emotional conflict was not proof that she lacked value. It was proof that he had moved too quickly while carrying unfinished feelings. And that realization softened something inside her. Her breakdown the day before had come partly from believing his attachment to you meant she had never been enough. Now she understood that another person's unresolved history does not measure someone else's worth. That truth did not erase the pain, but it gave the pain a different shape. She no longer needed to defeat you to feel whole. She needed to decide what kind of relationship she was willing to accept from this point forward. So she asked him a harder question than the one before: if she never answers, what do you do then? He stared at the dark phone screen. This time he did not hesitate long. "I still have to change," he said. "Because the problem wasn't only that I lost her. The problem was how I handled what mattered." The third party looked at him differently after that. Not with immediate forgiveness. Not with romantic relief. With recognition. Perhaps for the first time, he had understood that closure could not depend entirely on you. You could answer. You could remain silent. You could be kind. You could be distant. Whatever you chose, he still had work to do within himself. And that meant his message to you was no longer a hidden test of whether his life could begin again. It was simply one honest act he should have made long ago. Then the phone lit up. Both of them saw it. Neither moved immediately. His breathing changed. The third party looked away, almost as though she wanted to give him privacy, but curiosity held her there. He reached for the phone. The notification was from you. For a second he did nothing. Then he opened it. Your response was shorter than he expected. There was no accusation. No dramatic reunion. No promise. You simply wrote that you had wondered for a long time whether the distance had meant you imagined the connection differently than he did. You said you appreciated the honesty. You also said you had changed during the time apart, and that whatever conversation came next, if any, needed to happen slowly and respectfully. He read the message twice. The third party watched his face carefully, expecting to see excitement. Instead, she saw relief. Deep relief. Not because you had invited him back. You had not. Not because he had suddenly received everything he wanted. He had not. He was relieved because for the first time the story between you contained truth on both sides. He looked at her and said, "She thought I didn't care." There was sadness in his voice. The third party replied, "Because you never gave her anything else to believe." He nodded. No defense this time. That was another turning point. He could finally hear the consequence without trying to escape it. Stay till the end, because what happened next surprised the third party more than your response itself. He began typing back, then stopped. She noticed. "What are you doing?" she asked. "I was about to explain everything," he said. But she said slowly. He deleted the paragraph. Then he wrote something much simpler, "I understand. Thank you for answering. I'll respect that." He sent it and placed the phone down again. That restraint changed something. The third party had expected him to rush toward you the moment an opening appeared. Instead, he respected the boundary you had placed around the conversation. And now she faced an uncomfortable realization of her own. Part of her had been hoping he would behave recklessly so she could finally make him the villain of the story and walk away without doubt. But he was doing something different. He was beginning to become more thoughtful precisely because the situation had forced him to confront the consequences of avoidance. This complicated her feelings. She still felt hurt. She still questioned whether their relationship could survive what had been revealed. But the revenge she had wanted yesterday felt strangely small now. What would it accomplish to embarrass him? What would it accomplish to make you uncomfortable? What would it accomplish to manipulate the situation so someone felt as powerless as she had felt? None of those things would give her what she truly wanted: self-respect, clarity, and a relationship where she never had to wonder whether someone was emotionally present. So she made a decision of her own. "I need space," she said. He looked up, visibly surprised. Perhaps somewhere inside, he thought your response would immediately become the center of the evening. Instead, she was reminding him that there was another person affected by his choices. "I'm not punishing you," she continued. "I just need to know what I want when I'm not trying to win against someone else." That sentence may have been the strongest thing she had said since the story began. She was stepping out of the triangle completely. Not because all her feelings disappeared, but because she finally understood that her future could not depend on whether you and he reconnected. She needed to choose based on what was healthy and honest for her. He respected that too. No begging. No promises designed to keep her from leaving the room. He simply said he understood. And in that quiet exchange, the strange idea of revenge transformed completely. Her revenge was not going to be chaos. It was going to be refusing to participate in confusion anymore. Her revenge was choosing dignity over competition. Her revenge was letting truth reveal what needed to remain and what needed to end without forcing an outcome. But there was still one mystery she had not solved. Because your message had contained a phrase that kept replaying in her mind, whatever conversation comes next, if any. She wondered whether that meant you still had questions. He wondered too. Yet neither of them knew that you had stopped before sending a second message, one you had written, deleted, rewritten, and saved without sending. A message containing the one thing you had never told him about the day everything changed. And if that message eventually reaches him, it will reveal that his silence was not the only misunderstanding that shaped this entire story. There was something you had hidden too, not because you wanted revenge, not because you wanted control, but because at the time you believed telling him would only make walking away harder. And that hidden truth is about to change what he thought he knew about why you finally let go.